While names like Madison and Hamilton and Washington generally dominate discussions about the Constitution, the founders, there are many other founders who played extremely vital roles. But most of them are totally overlooked or ignored. So on this episode, I'm going to highlight some contributions of 10 others. Some I'm sure you're pretty familiar with. I'm sure those of you who watch or listen regularly will know all of these names, but maybe there's a few that you're not. And this is going to include people like Wilson, Dickinson, Rutledge, Mason, Randolph, and others. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, August 28th, 2024. And for this episode, I'm going to be highlighting a number of articles in a series, The Founders and the Constitution, written by a longtime TAC friend, Rob Nadelson. And he kicks it off with this. This is an important kind of precursor to understand the terms that we're using. He said, before proceeding, some terminology may be helpful. When we use the word framers, it means the 55 men who drafted or framed the Constitution. They were the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, really the Philadelphia Convention is the right name, held in Philadelphia from May 25th, 1787 to Constitution Day, September 17th, 1787. The word ratifiers means the 1,648 delegates at the 13 state ratifying conventions meeting from December 1787, we're looking at Delaware, Pennsylvania, etc., to May of 1790, Rhode Island was the last one. And the term founders includes the framers, the most significant ratifiers, and major opinion leaders in the public debate over the Constitution. Now, there were actually a pretty wide range of viewpoints at the founding. They weren't just a blob. You've got a whole spectrum, a political spectrum, and there are various categories or factions of founders. And today I've got people, the top people really, in the five main ones. The first one we can call, and these are the terms that Rob uses, but I think they're actually pretty good. The first one are the high nationalists. And he writes that they welcomed American independence, but they really admired the British political system and would have preferred to partially replicate it in America or even make it worse. However, the high nationalists recognized that Americans would never accept a king or hereditary aristocracy as the next best alternative, kind of like, oh, we're not going to be able to convince them to go for this, so let's go for option two. This certainly was Alexander Hamilton's approach when he came up with a plan of government, even though he wasn't supposed to as a delegate from New York. He came up with this plan in June 18th, I believe, 1787 at the Philadelphia Convention. He basically said, like, look, I'd love to get rid of the states, but most people aren't going to go for it. So here's my alternative. Now, his view was really on the extreme end of things, and it was rejected, but it's out there. Anyways, as the next best alternative, the high nationalists proposed what they called a high-toned republic, an executive chosen for life, and lifetime senators to complement an elected House of Representatives. High nationalists favored the British model of an all-powerful central government, in power in all cases whatsoever, specifically a veto power, for example, over the states, things like this. Now, the term high-toned, I think, is really interesting because I did an episode in June this year, was the Constitution sold on a lie, Shays' Rebellion and Ratification. Many of the framers, the founders told us or were complaining about Shays' Rebellion. They were warning Henry Knox, Hamilton, Madison, and others, that if a stronger, more energetic central government wasn't created, there was going to be total anarchy and civil war and chaos. Well, I guess we got some of that anyways. But what was interesting that I highlighted in that episode was that James Madison later in life admitted that, well, it was kind of overhyped to create a more high-toned system than what was actually authorized. That'll be linked to in the show notes, but I wanted to mention that because that term high tone. Now, these high nationalists, this included, of course, Hamilton, who I'm not covering today, but also John Adams and Gouverneur Morris of New York. Now, John Adams, unlike the other ones that I'm covering in this episode, he wasn't at the Philadelphia Convention. He also wasn't really a big participant in the state ratifying conventions. He was the ambassador to England at the time and didn't return home until the ratification debates were well underway. But his biggest contributions to the structure of the Constitution came from writing stuff, and that's how Rob puts it. Adams's chief contribution was the first volume of his 3-volume set, A Defense of the Constitutions of the United States, which were published in early 1787. They were circulated widely at the Philadelphia Convention, and then participants in the debates over ratification from September of 1787 through May of 1790 mentioned this book very often. Basically, this is kind of the structure we're going for. Now, but in it, he had a lot of praise for the British system. You can tell from his writing in this book that, he liked the hereditary monarch, hereditary House of Lords, elected House of Commons, so he wanted kind of a structure like that, but he didn't want to replicate it exactly in America. He wanted some differences. Rob puts it like this. In his defense, Adams emphasized 4 basic constitutional principles. First, just laws are enacted by the consent of the governed or by their chosen agents. That seems legit. Second, for a people to be free, the rule of law must prevail. That sounds legit as well, too. Third, I shouldn't actually opine on all this. I'm just going to share you the info. You can figure it out. Otherwise, this is going to go forever. Third, the best government mixes democratic, aristocratic, and monarchical features. And then finally, the best mixed government consists of a bicameral legislature with a Democratic branch and an aristocratic branch, kind of like the House of Commons and House of Lords, an independent chief executive, and an independent judiciary. You can see how much of this structure was how the Constitution was put together. But he really did like that British system. And you can see even later on, years after the Constitution was ratified, not too far after, but Mercy Otis Warren, in her great multi-volume history of the American Revolution, she lamented near the end of the book John Adams's kind of flipping the switch from the Atlas of Independence, advocate of natural rights and liberty, into becoming a monarchist. And she suggested that he spent too much time in the halls of power in England when he was gone. He was not a fan of that. Longtime friendship, they had some problems. But we can also back up to another piece that Adams wrote in 1776. It was a short pamphlet called Thoughts on Government. I read this very early on. It's really interesting stuff. But in this, Adams proposed a bicameral legislature with the lower house elected by the people and the upper house elected by the lower house for fixed terms. So they were going to have the Senate wasn't going to be chosen by the states. The Senate was going to be chosen by the members of the House of Representatives. He also suggested that the duties of the upper house be structured so it could mediate between the executive and the lower house, the House of Representatives. And we can see this in the Constitution. It reflects this idea by granting the Senate some executive powers, including the authority to advise and consent on presidential treaties and executive branch nominations. The Anti-Federalists didn't like that. They didn't like a blending of executive and legislative powers, but the Adams system, which is, I think, really kind of the baseline for a lot of what we have. And Rob points out that Thoughts on Government also foreshadowed several other features in the final Constitution. The president's power to commission and therefore instruct officers, presidential appointment and senatorial approval of judges, and judicial lifetime service during good behavior. Next up was Gouverneur Morris. We can call him kind of the penman of the Constitution. And Rob writes that in Morris's view, the central government should enjoy almost unlimited power. Now, he wasn't as extreme as Alexander Hamilton, but he certainly was very, very close. And in many ways, he may have been worse, but he wasn't as prominent, especially after ratification. He thought it should contain a single chief executive elected indirectly for life, with a power to appoint national officers and have an absolute veto power over all legislation. So basically, kind of the kingly monarchical view. It should also feature a bicameral legislature with both houses apportioned according to measures of wealth and population. Morris believed the lower house should be elected by the people, but an aristocracy, either by birth or merit. So this is what he was trying to get into the Constitution. I've seen some people leave comments on some of our posts on social media talking about the framers as monarchists, and I would never use that as a blanket term. But when you look at people like Gouverneur Morris and Alexander Hamilton and a little bit from John Adams, you can see their tendencies towards a lifetime kind of an elected king. You get elected, they stay there for life during good behavior. I mean, the whole impeachment process has never really worked out too well. So he believed that they should be by birth or merit, and that was inevitable, so they should be represented in the Senate. He said senators should be appointed by the executive for life. So you'd have this lifetime kind of elected king who would appoint senators who would serve for life as well. Now, it's not much different in some ways with the Senate because they're there until they die many times, way beyond the time that they should be, but that's a different problem. The Senate should also have the authority to initiate the tax bills, which they don't. They should be eligible for executive office, thus replicating a British practice most Americans derided as corruption. So they did not want this intermingling. Now, Morris also thought a ban on ex post facto laws was unnecessary. It shouldn't be in there, but they put it in there. And he favored ratification of the Constitution by a single national convention instead of conventions held in separate states. He did not like the idea of federalism at all. He wanted one singular national blob. Now, he also was a major architect of the presidential election system, the electoral college. He made the motions that led to several other provisions, including the suspension clause. This is Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2, full faith and credit in Article 4, and the property clause, also in Article 4, that's Section 3, Clause 2. He spoke, from my understanding, he spoke number 1 or number 2 of all the delegates in Philadelphia. So he was very, very prominent. But he was also, on the interesting end of things, he was a radical and vehement opponent of slavery. So he wants all this centralized power, which would result in political slavery for everyone. But he was opposed, at least on a positive end, to chattel slavery. He was on the Committee of Style, where he was assigned the writing of the first draft of the text of the Constitution. I believe he was also the drafter of the preamble to the Constitution. Next up on our spectrum are the moderate nationalists. They're still nationalists, but not as radical and extreme as Adams, as Hamilton, as Gouverneur Morris. And here how Rob puts it. Next on the spectrum were the moderate nationalists. They also sought a very powerful central government, but they were more Republican and Democratic than the high nationalists. So it's just kind of a little bit in degree. Moderate nationalists were willing to reserve a constitutional place, although a subordinate one, for the states. Now that includes James Madison. He did not, he didn't want to get rid of the states. He just wanted them to have very little power. His proposal, along with Edmund Randolph, who we'll cover later in this episode, was to basically have a veto power over the state. The states could do stuff, but the federal government would have to agree with it. So very subordinate. So this includes James Madison, George Washington, who I think is kind of difficult to place exactly on this spectrum, and Rob agrees on that as well. But this guy as well, James Wilson. At the convention, Rob writes, Wilson supported 1, direct election of senators, 2, divorcing presidential elections from the states, 3, creating a council of revisions with an absolute veto over congressional bills. So this was going to be once they passed something, it wouldn't be the executive branch, the king, the president vetoing stuff. There would be kind of a council in the executive branch who would have total power to veto. If they decided to veto, there was no override whatsoever. 4, also granting Congress an absolute veto power over state laws, so the states would be totally subordinate. And then 5, relegating the states to a subordinate position. And 6, at least at one point during the Philadelphia Convention, he really pushed pretty hard for a lifetime appointment or a lifetime term for the president. Now, all of his colleagues rejected every single one of his ideas. He was seen as too extreme, just like Hamilton. But he was a really highly respected guy, at least in the law. Now, at the convention, Wilson also opposed an ex post facto law, a ban on ex post facto laws, a grant to Congress permitting it to define and punish offenses against the law of nations, and he was opposed to enumerating powers. He did not even want the federal government to be one of delegated and reserved powers. That's how much power he wanted in the national government, and he wasn't the most extreme. He was part of the second tier of the nationalists, but his colleagues overruled him on all of those proposals as well in the Philadelphia Convention. But he was actually, his impact, even though what he wanted to get done, what he supported was rejected in Philadelphia, what he opposed was rejected in Philadelphia, where he had the most impact was in the ratification debates. His State House Yard speech, October 6, 1787, really became the playbook for the messaging from the Federalist side of this. They basically took his arguments and ran with it. And I think there's something to be said for a guy who really wanted much more power than what was authorized, but didn't actually try to twist, well, in some ways, at least at this point during ratification, what he did was he told people what they came up with, and he sold it aggressively, maybe because he thought, like Hamilton, that in the years to come they would come up with something else that's bad, but he did not try to twist it beyond what they actually sold, what they actually came up with in Philadelphia. And this is how Rob puts it. His national impact was due largely to his October 6, 1787 speech in the State House Yard, which responded to criticisms of the Constitution. The speech was reprinted in 34 newspapers in 12 states, so this was published widely. I read recently, I think it was just in the last day or so, the Federalist Papers, who we all think are the most important documents explaining the Constitution, well, they had very limited impact during the ratification debates. I believe only 25 of the 85-ish of them that were published were ever printed outside the state of New York. They were written to an audience in New York, so they really had no impact on how people decided whether or not they were going to support or oppose ratification almost anywhere. So he was the playbook for the Constitution's defenders until largely superseded by the essays in the Federalist. But that was after ratification was a done deal. Wilson also emphasized that the new federal establishment would be limited to the powers enumerated in the Constitution. And that's what I think is actually a positive on him. Even though he opposed the idea of enumerating powers and keeping it limited to those delegated powers, once they came up with it, he's like, all right, I'm a team player. I'm going to push for this. In fact, he said they were so limited that the new government could not, for example, threaten the freedom of the press. This was the Federalist argument against adding a Bill of Rights. They said it would create confusion. If this is a government of delegated powers or enumerated powers only, then if there's no power to intermeddle with the right to keep and bear arms, the trial by jury, the right of free press and free speech, etc., then it doesn't exist. So if we add it, people are going to assume that things are actually reversed. And that's how a lot of people treat it today. But anyways, Rob says Wilson implicitly renounced his theory of inherent sovereign authority, which is what he pushed for at least as early as 1781, just unlimited power, final authority in a central government. Now, the fact that he was pushing for this has had really bad long-term effects, despite the fact that he was honest in how he sold the Constitution to the ratifying public. And Rob puts it like this: despite the clear wording of the 10th Amendment, apologists for federal power still use James Wilson's inherent sovereign authority theory. They use it regularly. In 1936, the New Deal Supreme Court relied on it to uphold expansive presidential powers over foreign affairs. In 2004, Justice Breyer mentioned it as a source of a congressional power over Indian tribes. Leftist law professors frequently employ it to justify federal intrusion into areas the Constitution reserves to the states. And despite Wilson's move away from this theory during ratification, whether he actually moved away from it as far as what he wanted or not is a different question, but what he was actually arguing for in law under the Constitution, he did move away. The seed that he planted, Rob writes, has become a weed that sprouts up again and again and again. So we often talk about how Hamilton really messed things up and Washington for signing things that Hamilton pushed. But James Wilson's inherent sovereign authority, this unlimited power in a central government, has really been used kind of quietly behind the scenes over and over and over by the progressives, the leftists, the statists, the supporters of the monster state. So we should be aware of that. Next on our spectrum here are the centrists, kind of middle of the road. And they favored a strong central or federal government. They actually wanted a federal government, but they wanted to restrict it to specifically listed or enumerated powers. So this is where we get into the people who are on board with just delegated and reserved powers. They're the ones that kind of won out during the day. Now, some centrists wanted the states to participate in electing or selecting federal officials as well. But unlike the moderate nationalists, they wanted enhanced protections for the rights of individuals and the position of the smaller states. So they were more into a system of federalism, not pure like under the Articles of Confederation, but certainly more in line with the rights of individuals and some decentralization. This included people like John Dickinson, John Rutledge, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman from Connecticut. And Dickinson, I think, is the most interesting of these. And Rob writes it like this. Only 3 weeks into the convention, John Dickinson prepared an outline for a proposed constitution. This included many features the delegates eventually adopted. Now, Dickinson was widely respected because he was already, I would call him the father of the Articles of Confederation. There were many people involved in drafting that, but the first copy of it is still in his handwriting. So Dickinson is well-versed in the law and in structuring constitutions, at least as far as you can be. But he was well respected because he drafted the thing. And he was still saying, like, we need to change it. So they respected that. They included many features the delegates eventually adopted in his proposal. Enumerated powers, selection of senators by state legislatures was a John Dickinson thing, a minimum age of 30 for senators, rotating elections, so every couple of years type of thing, restrictions on the states issuing money, so to ban issuance of paper money like what was happening in Rhode Island and elsewhere, guarantees of trial by jury and habeas corpus, and the embryo, the beginning of what became the necessary and proper clause. Now, maybe we're not a fan of that one because it's so vague and broad, but I mean, we can understand the legal rules behind it, even though the Anti-Federalists probably were onto something where they're saying, look, no matter how you explain it to us, people with power are going to twist this one. But Dickinson was very much responsible for a lot of what became the Constitution for the United States. And Rob says that one of Dickinson's most important constitutional contributions was his role in developing the concept later known as dual sovereignty, by which the central government would have sovereignty as to enumerated or listed objects, and the states would be sovereign as to all other matters. Now, we know that the people are above all of that, so when we're talking about final authority, these are representatives or agents of the people of all the states as one for the enumerated powers, or each individual states reserved to the people of the several states. Dickinson thought that the states should be equally represented in the Senate, and he envisioned states actively checking the federal government. So he was really pushing for states to be an integral part of keeping the federal government in check, the states and the people themselves. This was a process that Rob points out that James Madison later called interpositions. And then during the ratification debates, he also published a pretty widely published and very influential series of essays in support of ratification using the pen name Fabius. I cite his Fabius essays often, especially number 4 on this show. They were distributed all across the country, and they were very, very influential. Next in this group of the centrists is John Rutledge. I don't think a lot of us really talk about him very often. He was the chair of the Committee of Detail, which was charged with preparing the Constitution's first draft. On that committee, it was Edmund Randolph who prepared the preliminary outline, but the principal editing is still today in Rutledge's handwriting. His notations include the forerunner to the necessary and proper clause. Here we go. We can see who's responsible for these things. And the provision allowing 2/3 of the state legislatures to force an amendments convention, keeping the states kind of more in charge when you get down to it. Now, he wanted the House of there's a number of things that he didn't get. He wanted the House of Representatives to also be elected by state legislatures, but the convention chose popular election. So you can see the seeds that he was planting for a more federal system rather than a high-tone nationalist system, because the states would be the ones choosing the members of the House of Representatives. He favored allocating representatives according to states' wealth or tax contribution, but the convention chose population, at least to some degree. He argued in vain for congressional election of the president, so the president was going to be chosen by Congress, but unsuccessfully opposed the origination clause, which granted the House of Representatives the exclusive right to initiate tax bills. This is Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1. And then one more from John Rutledge. There is an astonishing number of things in the Constitution that come, and again, the centrists were really the ones that kind of brought everybody together on the extremes. They're the ones that made the deals, Dickinson and Rutledge and others. But there's a bunch of stuff that Rutledge proposed or supported in Philadelphia that ended up in the final Constitution. I'll just include a few here. Federal powers are specifically listed or enumerated. The executive branch is headed by a single president rather than a council like George Mason and Benjamin Franklin actually preferred. The House of Representatives would have 2-year terms. Ex post facto laws, bills of attainder, are banned. Treason and bribery are grounds for impeachment. Unfortunately, I have to add, but they don't use it nearly enough on that treason thing. State and federal office holders must take an oath before actually assuming office. So the oath of office really comes from John Rutledge and a few others. And the Constitution and the constitutional federal laws and treaties are the supreme law of the land. The Supremacy Clause, we can also point to people like Rutledge for putting that in the Constitution. Now, all this stuff, these articles and a couple of other episodes that I'm mentioning, they will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. You're thinking, Bolden, you're just hammering through this so fast, and I know I am, and I'm really just scratching the surface. But I'm going through a bunch of articles to go through these 10 founders and just highlighting very, very, what I think are really impactful things. But Rob has a whole kind of overview of their life and contributions early on, before the Philadelphia Convention, after ratification, etc., that I think if you're interested in profiles of each of these founders, you'll definitely love reading this stuff. It's really easy to read things, too. And again, that'll be linked to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley organizes a blog post for every single episode and puts that all together. I'm very grateful for his consistent and awesome work, and he's a pretty funny dude, too, so you got to check out his show as well. And then I get that published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. And I've got a lot more to go here, so I'm not going to go through the live chat, although I see Brewster and Haji and Kirk and Lynn and a bunch of other people. I appreciate you being here, Howard, and a few others. But let's get right back to it. We're going through the centrists. Benjamin Franklin is another one. Now, Benjamin Franklin, he wanted a plural executive. He wanted an executive council. He thought a singular executive would be like a monarchy. He said he warned, for example, that your executive will always be increasing here like it does everywhere else till it ends in a monarchy. And even if it's an elected monarchy, what Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, and others call an elective despotism, it's an elected president in name only because it acts much more powerful than a lot of the kings of old. But anyways, rather than the negative part of here, Rob points out that one of the ways that Benjamin Franklin contributed to the framing of the Constitution was by composing documents that helped pave the way for the Constitution. All the way back to, he was writing constitutions or compacts really early on, decades before, all the way back to 1754. He teamed up with Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts to write something called the Albany Plan of Union, which is a blueprint for a federation of the American colonies. 1754. This is well before the Stamp Act. They weren't talking about independence, but instead it was going to be a separate union that was still part of the British Empire. Now, the British actually didn't approve it. You had to get approval from them to do this, but it still was really influential. The general concept, Rob writes, and some of its specific language influenced later documents. For example, the chief executive of the proposed federation was a president general, meaning a common president, at least in that context. I know the Anti-Federalists oftentimes use President General, but I think they were using it in kind of a sarcastic way, depending on the context, of course. They were talking about the President General because he was going to be the commander-in-chief as well, and they warned this kind of dude with all this power and authority over the military forces was going to act, again, like a king. So the chief executive of the proposed federation in 1754 was the President General, meaning common president. There was a reference to a House of Representatives, and a section that looked a lot like Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, which is the Indian Commerce Clause. And I think actually even more important than that was a year before the Declaration of Independence. Most people never ever talk about this or have never even heard of this. Benjamin Franklin actually drafted and submitted to the Continental Congress in July of 1775 the first completed proposal for an Articles of Confederation. This was even before Thomas Paine was writing about having some kind of proposed government in common sense in 1776. This is before the Lee Resolution in June of 1776 calling on the Continental Congress to put together a plan of government and work with foreign nations and draft a declaration and all those things. But he had this first proposal, and we actually still have it to this day. I covered in some detail in an episode a couple of years ago. Benjamin Franklin's Articles of Confederation. You can see a lot of the influence on Dickinson's Articles of Confederation and some precursors to the Constitution for the United States. Now, next up in the centrist group is Roger Sherman, who I also cite pretty often here. He was the guy who when we're talking about enforcing the Constitution, he had this great statement in December of 1787 saying all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void, nor would they be enforced contrary to a sense of the majority of the states. He also recognized, like Dickinson and Madison, that the states would play an essential part in keeping the government in check. Well, if you wanted to keep the government in check, you needed the states to not participate in the enforcement of federal acts that are usurpations of power, which are happening 24/7, 365. But Sherman made the first official motion. I believe it was Dickinson a few days earlier who actually discussed it. He said he wanted to see an enumeration of powers, but I think it was Roger Sherman, at least according to Rob here, who made the first motion to specifically list or enumerate the federal government's powers. It was rejected, but eventually the Committee of Detail with his basically co-worker from Connecticut, Oliver Ellsworth, they decided to adopt it. Sherman was also one of the first to point out that the courts could strike down unconstitutional laws. So this is about the courts having the power of judicial review. This was already discussed in the Philadelphia Convention. He also made the motion for 6-year terms for senators, although earlier he had suggested 5 years. And he successfully proposed that and this might be actually pretty relevant these days, if no presidential candidate received a majority of the Electoral College, a runoff election would be held in the House of Representatives with each state casting one vote. So the states have the final say. This is a Roger Sherman proposal at the Philadelphia Convention that we may see play out. Now, during the ratification debates, he wrote a series of essays for the Federalist side that were relatively influential, not as much, I would say, Tench Coxe, probably number one, then probably John Dickinson. Well, James Wilson's State House Yard speech was incredibly influential. All these are more influential than the Federalists, probably a countryman as well. This is Roger Sherman's series. Next on the spectrum, we're getting close to the wrap-up on this, are the Conditional Federalists. These who wanted federalism on the Constitution, but only on the condition that it is amended. They were like, well, as it now stands, it's got some good features, but I'm not going to be in favor of it unless we have some amendments. Among the changes Rob writes they sought were a Bill of Rights, a more democratic House of Representatives, stronger protection for the states against central interference. And we can see this all over the place in the ratifying documents in places like Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, New Hampshire, and elsewhere, where they actually said, hey, we agree to ratify this, but we want to recommend a series of amendments. They weren't conditional amendments, but it was kind of a gentleman's deal that if you don't do these, well, we're really not on board. And at the top or right close to the top on all of these lists were a proposal to basically a precursor to the 10th Amendment. Those powers not delegated to the federal government would be reserved to the states or to the people. And they also wanted full state control of federal elections. Now, this included Edmund Randolph, who became Attorney General. He was the governor of Virginia. He became the Attorney General under George Washington, and George Mason. Let's start out with Mason. He was actually part of the team that came up with the so-called Virginia Plan at the beginning of the Philadelphia Convention, which proposed a very powerful central government. And it was the primary discussion for the first anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, depending on how you count it and see things. But Mason was part of that team with James Madison, Edmund Randolph, Wythe, Washington, etc. More of his views were accepted at the convention than were rejected. For example, the central government should be able to enforce its laws directly on the people rather than asking the states to do so. One of the complaints from the Federalist side was that under the Articles of Confederation, if any state just decided not to do things, then the federal government couldn't get things done. Alexander Hamilton complained about this in Federalist 16, and it actually is insight in how to defeat the federal government today. That is, he said, if the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, all they have to do, and this is now my paraphrase, all they have to do is not act or act evasively and the measure is defeated. Now, to them, that sounded terrible. To me, you're threatening me with an awesome time by saying this is all that needs to be done if the government relies on the states to implement or effectuate its programs, which it does on everything today. But they created a system where the federal government was only going to have limited powers. And then on top of it, to do those limited powers, it wouldn't rely on the states. It would impact the people directly. It wouldn't coerce sovereign bodies, states, in their political capacity, is how the third Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth put it. Also, he said that each state should have 2 senators. The president should be able to veto bills subject to an override by a supermajority. This is a George Mason proposal, or he was on board with this. Other high crimes and misdemeanors should be grounds for impeachment, also not used very often, should be used all the time. Congress shouldn't be able to veto state laws. So he was one that pushed the convention away from this original Virginia plan proposal and Hamilton and the others, Morris, who wanted the federal government to have total yes and no power, just like the British did over the colonies. What they fought a long, bloody war to get away from. And then the states should be able to amend the Constitution without the approval of Congress. Now, he helped construct the Constitution in Philadelphia, but then he also ended up opposing ratification. And as the convention wore on, he started to raise some serious questions about what was being put together. So he actually started out working on some proposals for a more powerful central government than what he was in favor later. Maybe he had a change of mind. Maybe he was just going along to get along. Who knows? But he eventually, the thing that really triggered him, at least from my reading, is that he vehemently opposed the deal which allowed the international slave trade to continue until 1808. He thought that was a deal breaker. And once that went, all of a sudden, maybe all the other things that he thought were kind of problematic were now something to really start complaining about. Because in the final days of the convention, he summarized a bunch of his issues in a document on the back of like a committee document. And it ended up getting out. It was widely published. He wasn't really excited about that. And it was relied on heavily during the ratification debates for the Anti-Federalist talking points. So we're talking about James Wilson being kind of the guy that framed the Federalist talking points. I would say George Mason is the one who really framed the Anti-Federalist talking points afterwards. And that's why I covered George Mason's Anti-Federalist arguments against ratification of the Constitution in an entire episode just a month ago. George Mason versus the Constitution. Alan Mosley will link to that in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Next up, we have Edmund Randolph. And he was the guy who, on May 29, 1787, just a few days after the convention started, he delivered the speech in support of the Virginia plan, which was going to give basically total centralized power. I mean, I did another episode on that. I didn't have it ready for today, but it was a really, really powerful central government, not all the way to Hamilton and Morris, but pretty close. We know these proposals, again, as the Virginia plan. They became the primary basis for the convention's discussion over 8 weeks. He participated vigorously in the debates in Philadelphia, usually successfully. He was sometimes in alliance with James Madison, sometimes always. He bore primary responsibility for these constitutional clauses that fixed the term of the House of Representatives for 2 years. He worked with others, obviously, addressed federal debts in Article 7, guaranteed each state a Republican form of government, required an early census to determine each state's representation in Congress, and provided that the Constitution would become effective if ratified by 9 of the 13 states rather than how it had to be unanimous under the Articles of Confederation. So whether these are good or bad, these are really, Edmund Randolph was either the guy or part of a team that gave us these things. Now, by the time that the ratifying convention came, well, by the end of the Philadelphia Convention, he decided he wanted amendments. He wasn't on board, and he was one of the few, him and Elbridge Gerry and George Mason, they didn't sign the Constitution. And that's how Rob puts it. Despite his success at the convention, Randolph balked at signing the finished document. He suggested changes that would enable him to sign, but his proposals were rejected. He concluded that the only way to obtain the alterations he wanted, and this was his proposal, was to permit state conventions to propose amendments to be reviewed by a second federal convention held before final ratification. So he was basically saying here's our proposal. Let's send it to the states. Let them propose amendments. We'll gather again in a second convention, and then we'll have the real ratification debates of whether or not we're going to accept this thing. And then he said, this is what I'm on board with. If we don't get that, I will not put my name to it. But by the time the Virginia ratifying convention, he decided to flip the switch because 8 states had already ratified, and he was actually more on board with creating union to defeat the fear of whatever would happen if they didn't have a new system than what he really believed was the proper process. You see people flip the switch like this on political principles all the time. So he was one of the leading Federalists arguing against Patrick Henry in the Virginia ratifying convention, and still with him and Madison and others arguing against Henry and Mason. They almost lost. It was really close. It was 89-79, I think, in the final tally. And that brings me to the last group on this spectrum, the firm Anti-Federalists. And Rob puts it like this. Some of these wanted to retain the Articles of Confederation with a modest increase in congressional power. Others didn't think a 13-state union was even viable. Like, it was a bad idea. You had to have multiple confederacies. They favored dividing the country. The most notable firm Anti-Federalist was Patrick Henry of Virginia. I absolutely agree. There are many others. There's Brutus and Cato, people that used pen names or pseudonyms. I think George Mason was very close to this, but he certainly was not as far to the Anti-Federalist side as Patrick Henry, who is opposed really no matter what. He did actually, you could also actually include Patrick Henry in the Conditional Anti-Federalist, because at the end of the Virginia ratifying convention, he's like, look, I'll sign this if we get a bunch of amendments. He proposed dozens of them. They were rejected, and so he was opposed. So I think there might be some classification errors here, but let's roll with it. Patrick Henry's number one concern on everything, underlying everything, the foundation underlying all of his arguments was a consistent warning against consolidation or centralization of power, and then trusting people with power to do the right thing when they have that power. For example, in Virginia in the summer of 1788, he said, look at this system. Okay, I agree. If you have a good person as president, if you have good people as senators, if you have good people in the House of Representatives, you've got no problem. But can that be expected from human nature? And we know, just like he knew, that if you rely on people to do the right thing when they have a lot of power, they're not going to do that very often. So he repeatedly warned about giving people too much power and trusting the system to work right because it's going to draw the good guys to power. He didn't think you could trust anybody. I covered that also. Patrick Henry's Anti-Federalist warnings, his top ones, in another episode that'll be linked to in the show notes. And to sum it up like this, I think Rob does real well. He said the Constitution, especially as amended by the Bill of Rights, which was pushed by people like Mason and Patrick Henry, wouldn't have it without them, wasn't the product of any one faction, conservative or otherwise. It was the product of negotiation among people of different views, with moderates working to bring all parties together. The result was a coalition spanning most, although not all, of the American political spectrum. Now, this isn't my normal type of episode, but I hope you found it interesting and educational. I hope you're interested in reading and learning more on these founders that many of us have forgotten or ignored for far too long, because I think it can give us the more insight we have into history, the more we can have smarter choices about going forward in the future. And nothing helps us do this kind of work more than the financial faith and support of our members. The education, the research, the podcasts, the articles, the emails, the blogs, the State of the Nullification Movement report we do, which shows how we're putting the founder strategy to keep the federal government in check within the bounds of the Constitution into practice. We're just scratching the surface, but that's available for free over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Nothing helps us do all this work more than your support. So if you've got any of that dirty government fiat laying around, you want to throw it some way, please consider giving it to us over here at the 10th Amendment Center. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options available. And no pressure. If you're not able to do that, we're going to continue doing this work day in, day out, 365 days a year. I rarely get a day off, once in a while, but we'll definitely keep pushing forward. But I'm very grateful for any consideration you give to joining us today. Also, some other things that you can do, please consider smashing the like button, subscribing, getting notifications, leaving reviews on podcast platforms. All this stuff will help trigger the algorithms, especially of the mainstream platforms, and help us reach and teach more people. Again, I really appreciate you being here. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you have an awesome day, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.